Good evening, everyone. I'm Steve Edwards, the Executive Director of the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to tonight's conversation, Chicago After Laquan McDonald. As many of you know, the mission of the Institute of Politics is to inspire and cultivate the next generation of public service leaders. Tonight's event is part of our ongoing speaker series, which aims to bring insights and context to some of the most critical and pressing issues of the day. And there could hardly be a more timely or critical conversation for us to have in Chicago than the one we're about to enter this evening. That's why we're very pleased to see all of you here with us, and why we're very honored to have our esteemed panel with us for the discussion. In just a moment, I'll turn things over to Patrick Quinn to introduce our program more formally and each of our panelists. But before I do, I wanted to let you know that we're recording tonight's conversation, and also to let those of you know who are on Twitter that you can follow the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics at IOP for the social media conversation. Speaking of conversation, we want to hear from you this evening, and as is customary at our events, we will turn the microphone over to the audience for questions later in the program. As is the case and as part of the tradition here at the University of Chicago, we ask that when we do, you do so in the best spirit of open dialogue and rigorous inquiry, and that you keep your questions short and to the point so that we can hear from as many of you as possible. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by the Chicago Style series, which is one of our student-run series at the Institute that focuses on issues of local politics and public policy. Patrick Quinn is one of the leaders of that group at the IOP. He's also been involved in a range of activities at the Institute, our events programs, our fellows programs. He's a third year in the college. He hails from New Haven, Connecticut. He will also be embarking as one of our Shriver Fellows, a new class of nearly 10 fellows who will be exploring critical issues facing Chicago and violence in this city that will begin tomorrow on a series of workshops over the course of the next 20 weeks this academic year. So please join me in welcoming Patrick Quinn to formally start our program tonight. Patrick?
Thank you, Steve, for that introduction. Good evening, everyone. As Steve said, my name is Patrick Quinn, and I have the privilege tonight of introducing the distinguished individuals comprising our panel. Today is January the 7th, 2016. It's been 444 days since 17-year-old Laquan McDonald was killed by Chicago police officer Jason Van Dyke. 226 days have passed since journalist Brandon Smith filed a request to see video of the shooting. Only 49 days have passed since a Cook County judge ordered the video's release over the objections of the city. And in the days following the release of the video, the city, and indeed the nation, erupted in protest over the city's handling of the shooting, a history of brutal police tactics, and the taking of Laquan McDonald's life. Now, 444 days after the death of Laquan McDonald, questions still remain. How did this happen? Who is at fault? And what changes should be made to fix a law enforcement system that is perceived to only protect some? Our panel tonight will offer insight into these questions and many others that our community in crisis faces. First off, Daniel Isom is a former chief of police for the city of St. Louis, an endowed professor of policing in the community at the University of Missouri St. Louis. Before being appointed chief of police in 2008, Dr. Isom served for 20 years as an officer in the St. Louis Police Department. He also served briefly as the director of public safety in Missouri following the death of Michael Brown. Jamie Kalven is a writer and human rights activist, as well as the founder of the Invisible Institute, a journalistic production company in Chicago's South Side, which works to improve government transparency and accountability. It's Mr. Kalven's reporting and the public records request for Laquan's autopsy that first brought a widespread public attention to the killing, and he has been a vocal critic in calling for both public activism and increased governmental transparency. Mary Mitchell has worked at the Chicago Sun-Times, where she has won numerous awards for her reporting and column writing for more than 2 decades. In her column, which has a substantial print following, she writes frequently about social justice, political issues, and politics. Finally tonight, I would like to introduce Kate Grossman, our moderator and the director of the Institute of Politics Fellows Program. Before joining the IOP, Kate was an award-winning journalist at the Chicago Sun-Times with nearly 20 years of experience covering public education, housing, and urban affairs in Illinois and the city of Chicago. Please join me in welcoming, on behalf of the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics, tonight's panel.
Thanks, Patrick. So welcome, everyone. I'm thrilled to see such a packed house. And you're really in for a treat. This is a fabulous group. I'm going to move up so I feel like I'm kind of talking to you. So I have known Mary and Jamie for a long time. Mary and I were colleagues for many years at the Sun-Times. And I know Jamie from my public housing reporting days. And I don't know Dan as well, but you have a reputation of thoughtfulness and creativity and problem solving. So we're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say tonight. I think we're really in for a provocative and meaty conversation on a topic that clearly is of great interest. I'm going to very briefly bring students up to speed. Students left here roughly mid-December. A lot has happened since related to Laquan McDonald. And I put pretty much all of it in the fallout category. As Patrick said, there's been protests, calls for the mayor to resign. And for me, as a longtime observer of Chicago, I think the most important thing has been sort of this deep-seated, widespread soul-searching that's gone on in Chicago in all kinds of neighborhoods about what kind of city we live in, what kind of city do we want to be, how do we fix this? And so that's the topic we're going to go for tonight. And also, just very briefly, we've had the focus has been really on the mayor, who has done his best to get out from underneath this bear with a lot of fits and starts. So he has gotten rid of his police superintendent. He fired the head of the agency that is supposed to investigate police misconduct. He released a second video of another police shooting. He gave a big mea culpa speech at City Council, and he has embraced, after not embracing, a federal investigation, civil rights investigation. But it doesn't stop there with the Laquan McDonald. As all of you know, we had another shooting in Chicago the day after Christmas, and a young college student, and an innocent bystander were shot by police. That prompted the mayor to fly back from a family trip he was on in Cuba and announce more reforms to the police department, which we really want to talk about. The focus tonight is, of course, how did we get here, but we really want to focus on how the hell do we get out of here? How do we do better? This problem that has plagued Chicago since before I was born, and hopefully we'll begin to make some changes. So I'm going to start with that and ask Mary, can we expect real change this time? This is not the first crisis of confidence we've had for the police department in Chicago and nationally. We're not the only city, as Dan can tell us, to go through, have convulsions in this way. So can something be different this time, and can you actually build the trust to make a difference?
Okay, so first of all, I think let's put the trust side on it. It's going to take a long time to rebuild trust. I mean, the gap between the community that's being policed and the police department is so wide, that's not going to close overnight. But you can't stop change. And the reason why you can't stop this change, because this is not just Chicago. Chicago is not an isolated incident. This is a policing problem that we're seeing across America. And activists across America are beginning to confront it. You have young people who have stepped up to the plate to say, we don't like this. We want something done about this. We want this to stop. Before, when we had police reform or talk to police reform, because it goes back to the John Birch cases. It goes back to police misconduct and putting together a new independent police review authority. We've done that. The difference here is that you have everyday people saying, this has got to change. We won't live like this anymore. And so I don't think that this is something that you can stop. It's going to stop after the lights go off, after the cameras shut down. No, that's not going to happen. I think this time we have a real opportunity to bring reform.
Dan, can you talk a little bit about what needs to change? How can you successfully create lasting change in the culture of a police department?
Well, I think as Mary said, this is happening in the context of a national conversation that's going on across America. So Chicago, along with many other communities, have a real opportunity to push law enforcement profession in a different direction. But there are a number of different levels that you have to address this on. First, you have to look at what is the expectation that you have as a community for your police department, especially with respect to policing communities, especially urban communities, and what type and level of force are you going to use to try to control those situations. That takes a different sort of mindset in trying to change the perspective of the culture of the police department. Stories tell a lot about how a group of people or a profession perceives their role in the community. I talked about this a little bit. One of the issues I think with police today in terms of a cultural perspective is we're here to protect and serve, right? So is that your first priority? Or is your first priority to actually protect yourself? That's a different orientation, right? I'm here to sacrifice myself for you, not just for the citizens of the community who are experiencing crime, that's even for people who might be suspects, people you might even arrest. My goal is to make sure I use the least amount of force necessary to take you into the custody. And sometimes that might mean allowing you to get away in some situations or backing off in some situations. So there are issues within the police department from a cultural perspective that needs to be addressed. But that doesn't go far enough. There have to be really real policy changes, administrative changes that address issues like training, issues of investigation and transparency. The window of opportunity to make real change will close over time. So you have to put systems in place that will continue to bring that information out into the light so that you can make adjustments when things happen.
Do you think, we did a kind of a pre-interview a couple days ago, and I asked the question, has any police department ever successfully done this? And what's your answer to that?
Well, there have been some that have made changes.
The answer was no.
Partial changes. Yeah. But I don't think in a very significant way, or we wouldn't be revisiting these issues in our community every 5 or 10 years. Mm-hmm. Most of the significant changes have come from consent decrees. Mm-hmm. I would have to say most police departments have not been able to make this transition on their own. It's taken a push from the federal government to make real, true change. That happened in Los Angeles to some degree. It happened in New York, but they still have some issues there. So it's not complete. I don't think it's ever complete. But you need to set systems in place where you're always looking at your police department, looking at your community, and seeing where you need to move forward and make adjustments.
And Jamie, can you talk about, because a lot of this is, of course we all know most cops do a good job and want to do a good job, but there's clearly a culture in the police department, a thin blue line, a code of silence, whatever you want to call it, where you sort of circle the wagons when something happens at the scene with the investigative authority, even the law department potentially for the city of Chicago. Can you just talk about that culture and whether you're optimistic that can ever really change?
Sure. So I think the Laquan McDonald incident that was sort of the occasion for this conversation and many others, is an infinitely regrettable event that we wish had not happened. It now, at this point, is also a precious public resource. This narrative, this story, this situation. And we have an obligation to learn everything we possibly can from this. And we have the means to do it because so much information has been disclosed. And one of the things that is most telling about it is it illustrates in great detail at every different level of the institution of the police department and the city how the code of silence actually works. I don't want to suggest that the execution of a child on the streets of the city is the norm. This was an extraordinary event. That's not to say there aren't, dozens of other horrific events, of similar gravity. But the response of the institution after that happened, from the officers on the scene to the highest levels of the city, was the norm. We're not dealing with a departure from the norm. We're dealing with the norm, which is, I think, really important diagnostically when we think about what's involved in changing this. The instinct, Dan was saying, this serve and protect, the instinct to protect not just oneself, but the institution. In some ways, a misplaced sort of loyalty. And it's where I've spent a lot of time talking with police officers about how the code of silence works and the consequences of breaking ranks and speaking out and facing retaliation and ostracism within the department. It's this extraordinarily strong culture, but it actually arises out of some recognizable human dynamics that I think a lot of us would share. Nobody likes a tattletale. We're in the foxhole together. I've got your back, you've got mine. That kind of loyalty and identification is not contemptible, but somehow it metastasizes into something else that really is toxic. And I think it's a fair statement, this is a quote from a police officer, that most police officers are more afraid of their fellow officers than of the young men in the street or the boys in the hood. I mean, this dynamic is so strong. I believe it can be changed. I think it's a heavy lift. I think it's a long-term project. I think it requires an extraordinary level of leadership and institutional commitment. Somebody once said of totalitarian regimes that when you have to be a hero to behave decently, to be a good friend, to be a good neighbor, when you have to court martyrdom to just behave with minimal decency, that's a seriously screwed up institution. Well, that's what we're dealing with here. So we have to create a situation where you don't have to be a hero to do your job.
Well, let me ask the political question. So lots of people have said Mayor Rahm Emanuel has to go. He's clearly not going. This guy is not a quitter. He's not going to be pushed out. Let's talk about whether does he have to go, or is he actually the guy, one of the only guys who can make a difference?
You want to go first? Yeah.
Well, let me just say, when you start talking about the mayor has to go, and you look at what happened with the Laquan McDonald case, then you really need to say everybody needs to go. Because the system failed. The media failed. The police department failed. The lawyers failed. The family failed. This was a breakdown from top to bottom. So while we all, when something bad happens, we want to find the bad guy. We want to say that's the bad guy, and that guy has to go. This is a terrible tragedy that forces us to look at ourselves. I felt terrible about the Laquan McDonald case. Why? Because while we were writing about Chirac and complaining about the name of a movie, there was information we should have been getting about how the 17-year-old boy ended up dead. That's the media responsibility. When we should have been asking Emmanuel and Chuy Garcia and everybody else who wanted to run for mayor, what happened? What happened with Laquan McDonald? We didn't ask those questions. So I personally can't put all that on the mayor. I think the mayor's office is part of the problem, but I think the institution, this is something that has been allowed to grow like a disease across and spread across the institutions in Chicago.
Can I respond as
Yeah.
well? I agree with everything Mary said, and I think that it's been fascinating, the ferocity of the focus on the mayor, just as a phenomenon.
Yeah.
It's been really interesting. I think that he has a great deal to answer for in the handling of the Laquan McDonald case, in the administration of the city around this constellation of issues. He inherited this. He didn't create this mess. And he could have done more to affect it. He accommodated to it. But the truth is it would have taken extraordinary leadership. If coming into office he had said, this is the issue I'm going to address, it would have taken, we're talking Nelson Mandela at that point, extraordinary leadership to really double down on this issue. And the crisis now that he finds himself in, an unprecedented crisis in his career and really in the life of the city, is a space in which he could be, and I'm not really talking about his vision, his character, I'm not in a position to assess that, but his circumstances are such that he could be a significant agent of change. But the other thing, it was suggested by what Mary said, that the focus on the mayor, everybody wanting to, put a noose around the mayor's neck, is also just a really fundamental misdiagnosis of what we're dealing with. If we were dealing with a cover-up, with a conspiracy, with the bad acts of a few high officials, that would actually be great news. That would be good news. That's not what we're dealing with. What we're dealing with are patterns of structural violence that are built into the society. To go to what Mary said, this is the society we've created. This problem doesn't exist apart from all of us. We are all implicated in that. To focus all our attention on the mayor and not recognize that that's the nature of the problem, that these are, there's been no spike in police shootings nationally. There hasn't been a spike, and in fact, police shootings are down in Chicago. So what's happened is the curtain has been drawn, this amazing set of circumstances that started in Ferguson and have unfolded now for many months. The curtain's drawn back. What's changed is our quality of attention to these questions.
Right.
And that's the huge challenge going forward. If it were just fixing a malfunction or a crisis or a breakdown, or the bad acts of a few.
Just throw the bums out.
Yeah,
But
throw the bums out, yeah.
This is an institutional problem.
Right.
Dan, as an outsider, and you've had your head knee deep in Ferguson.
That's a great image.
Sorry, mixing my metaphors.
I'm still working on it. I'm working on it.
All right, comic relief. You've been busy with Ferguson.
Yes.
Can you give us a little outside perspective, on the attention on a manual and whether that's warranted, a distraction, helpful? Like, what do you see from the outside?
Well, it depends. One of the things is if you have systemic and institutional problems and you get rid of the head of an organization, that is not necessarily going to cure your problem. That person will be removed, but you still have the core of the issue that remains. And so, whether the mayor leaves or not is not going to solve the underlying issues in the community. In the situation with Ferguson, it unfolded a little bit differently in that the chief of police at the time, related to Ferguson, he was seen to be sort of intimately involved in decisions and the problems that were happening within the community. And we had a lot of unrest. And people were looking for something immediate at the time. And so in that case, I think it would have made a tremendous difference if the chief would have stepped down immediately. That would have calmed the community because it would have been sort of immediate realization that this is a real problem. That didn't happen. And so the tension, the anger in the community continued to be fueled by the fact that nothing was being done. Here in Chicago, after the video came out, there was very quick movement. And things started to happen rapidly. And so I think that was a huge difference and a positive point in terms of what happened in your community. Even though it might have taken a long time for it to come out, when it did come out, people acted swiftly. So it's really about trying to deal with the core issues. The way we went about it in St. Louis with respect to Ferguson was to develop a commission, an independent commission that had really two goals. One was to hear from the community and a process of healing. Let the community throughout the metropolitan area of St. Louis come forward. Let's hear what you have to say. Let's hear your stories. And let's take that information and use it as a blueprint to develop a pathway forward. And we tried to be very diverse in the areas that we went to. We listened to people throughout the St. Louis community, and it was really eye-opening for many people outside of the metropolitan area, the urban areas, to hear the stories of people who have been affected by bad policing. And I think it was a revelation to the wider community. That's very important because oftentimes issues in urban communities only are issues to urban people, right?
Right.
But it is something that affects the greater community. This is about Chicago and the metropolitan area of Chicago, not one particular area or one particular community. You start to realize that when Laquan McDonald issues and Michael Brown issues happen, it affects the entire community in so many different ways. And so now we're at a point where we've collected all that community information. I think people have been able to express themselves and relieve themselves of the stories that they've had for so many years. But we're still at the point where we have to start to implement those strategies. And so that's sort of the next phase that we have in St. Louis.
I'm going to raise a contrarian point of view, which is, and Jamie just mentioned this, if you look at police-involved shootings in Chicago, they're actually way down. We had, in 2011, we had 56 police shootings, 24 of them were fatal. In 2015, there were 22, 8 fatal. And it's been going down. And I don't think it's just an accident. There have been some changes in policy, or maybe it's an accident. But I'm being generous here. I'd like to think there have been some changes in policy. Are we overreacting?
No, there's no way to overreact as to a 17-year-old getting killed by a police officer shot 16 times. The number of bullets showed that there's something wrong with the thinking. That's just brutality. That's just, once, we might have, somebody got shot once, well, he had a knife and he was, acting strange, and you might be able to accept that. But there was the idea that a police officer could shoot a 17-year-old 16 times while he's walking away. It was how it happened.
Right, but so I guess what I'm asking is, when we take Laquan McDonald, the question is, two bad apples, or is it a huge systemic problem?
But see, this is where we don't know. We don't know the extent of the problem because we have bought into for so long, well, he had a gun, and they tried to run over me, they tried to run me down. We don't know. What came out of the McDonald case was that policemen lied.
Yeah.
They lied. So if they lied about, in this case, and there's a videotape that certainly is out there going to show that you lied, what about all these other cases? Mm-hmm. So I think that, no, it's not an overreaction. We had to react in order to get to the root of the problem so you can begin to fix it.
But I think I agree in terms of the gravity of, the reaction to something grave and fundamental. I think it's been a distorted reaction in various ways. And I think part of the challenge going forward, and not least of all for us as journalists reporting on this and for public officials building a public narrative, is that this is a problem that really has a shape and a definition. I mean, putting aside the code of silence for the moment, mm-hmm. which implicates everybody in the police department, the kind of egregious acts of brutality, the affronts to human dignity that Mary was invoking, this is highly, highly patterned behavior. We have statistics that we've made public. If anybody's interested, there's something called the Citizens Police Data Project, which various statistics we've been able to, data we've been able to access from the city through litigation and Freedom of Information Act requests, we've made public, and it's, you can interact with it and analyze it. One of the striking things in these statistics, which overwhelmingly show a lack of accountability, is they also show that upwards of 80%, 83% of police officers have 0 to 4 complaints in the course of their entire careers. A relatively small, we're not talking a few bad apples, it's still a significant number, and they're not evenly distributed through the city, so there's some areas where you encounter a lot of these guys. But a relatively small proportion of the force accounts for the lion's share of complaints. They operate, to date, this may be changing, and certainly what we want to see change, they operate with an extraordinary level of impunity. So they know that they won't, and you see guys when, it's most telling is when somebody, some of you in Chicago remember the special operations scandal of 2006, 2007. Some of the officers at the very top of our list were the racketeers and criminals at the center of that. They went through their whole careers with complaint after complaint after complaint, and nothing ever sustained. So they knew that they operated, and once they're indicted, Jerry Finnegan, the kind of ringleader of the SOS team, is doing a 14-year sentence, I think, in Florida. There were countless, not countless, but 60, 70, 80 citizen complaints against him, alleging precisely the patterns of criminal conduct that he was ultimately indicted for. So we have a system that's not, I used to say it was a broken system. I don't think that's the right image anymore. I mean, it's a system that probably has functioned pretty well, but for ends completely antithetical to the public interest. So, there's a highly concentrated problem, highly patterned. You can know these guys by name and address and assignment. I mean, right. The knowledge is in the system to fix the system. Everybody in the neighborhoods knows who the bad cops are.
Right.
Everybody at the district level knows among their colleagues who's bad. But we don't have the machinery to hold them accountable.
And Dan, how common is this pattern? Like, do you see this in St. Louis or other police departments that you study?
I think it's fairly common that when you look at shootings across police departments and communities, you find that there are a number of officers who receive multiple complaints on a regular basis. And you can't really view this in the context of one incident or from year to year. Really, this is a historical pattern that has happened over a number of years. And so even if numbers go down by 10 or 13, that really is not felt by the community. The community is not looking at numbers from year to year.
Right.
They're looking at patterns of behavior. And when they see the same patterns of behavior from officers in the community, whether it goes up or down, they still are impacted by that behavior. And those stories carry throughout a community. 5% of your officers having contact with the community can have a devastating impact on the trust and legitimacy of your agency. That's huge. And so there are a number of challenges to dealing with those officers. Not all of it is about the will of the agency to do it. There are barriers up there to getting information out. We'll take the Laquan McDonald case. Oftentimes, prosecutors and other officials will say, well, we need to keep this information under wraps because there's an investigation. It might compromise the investigation. Those are policy decisions that will not let information come to light. And so that's a challenge when you have issues that don't come out into the public space. There's also issues in terms of, administrative rules around disciplining officers. You can't necessarily fire an officer without an administrative hearing. So there are a lot of issues that go into sort of this code of silence that are not just cultural, but also structural in nature that make it very difficult to deal with officers who have repeat patterns of misconduct and complaints.
Can I just follow on one thing that Dan said? Because I think it's important in understanding the nature of the problem to understand how much impact a relatively small group of officers can have if they can act with impunity. And I would go further than saying, I've seen situations in neighborhoods and public housing developments where one team of gang tactical officers can alienate a whole community from civil authority when they can come around every day and run their game, whatever it is, ripping off drug dealers, physical abuse, outright racist behavior. If those guys aren't held accountable, and if people feel like there's no redress in the neighborhood, then there's more than a backing away. I mean, a real alienation from not just the police, but from the civil order. I mean, Mary's written a lot about this. So you have patterns of, we often too broadly characterize it as gang violence, of retaliatory violence, that really often takes the form, in my experience, of people saying, I don't trust the police to fix this. I'm going to, find my own justice.
Right.
We're going to handle it ourselves. And then, and then the police become less effective. It's this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy where you ask people, would you call the police under these circumstances? And they will sometimes say no, because the police can't close a murder case. They can't close a murder case because nobody will cooperate with them.
Right.
So these are not separate phenomena.
So Dan, if you had a top 3 list of meaningful change, not tinkering along the margins, not something small, but that you could really do, whether it's changing the police contract, making a truly independent, independent review authority. What's your top 3 list of meaningful change?
So I think the first change has to come from the top. It really has to be a different philosophy of how you want to police the community and what you expect from your police department. You cannot police a community without the support of the community. It's fundamental that that is the basis of being a police officer or being a police agency. And so your orientation, your philosophy has to be that we are going to do everything we have to do to connect to the community, to try to work collaboratively as partners to address the issues within the community. The second part is that police departments are not occupying forces. We are not coming into communities to control behavior. That's a fallacy, and it puts police officers in a position where they believe that they have to use force to control neighborhoods. And so I think that's fundamental to changing the philosophy of how police departments address crime and disorder within their communities. So that is critical as a starting point. The second part, I think, is very important, is actually giving them the training and the tools to be able to do that. I think oftentimes we are expecting officers to do things that we haven't trained them to do and given them the skills to be effective at. Today, people expect a higher level of skill for officers. They want executive skills, communication. How do you manage conflict? Using force, using your gun, using your baton, those are not the expectations of the public. They may not have even expected that 30 years ago, but they didn't really care about whether or not officers use that type of strategy to deal with neighborhoods. And so there has to be more of a focus on giving officers the training that's needed to be an effective officer today. And so that's the philosophy and training part. But there's another end that deals with openness and transparency, because people are going to have more confidence in the police department when they actually know what's happening within the organization. When you give that information freely to the public, not only that, it helps the community be a part of shaping the police department. If you really have a community policing philosophy, then the community has to have access to all the information necessary to help you to build a good police department. So that's an important, those are, I think, 3 important areas that could make a huge difference.
I'm sorry, and before I turn away from you, I have to ask the question, are you going to apply to be police chief here in Chicago, police superintendent? Come on, you knew it was coming.
I don't plan to at this point in time.
Well, I hear the deadline is January 15th, so just bear that in mind. I want to go back, so we've been kind of looking forward, which I think everybody wants to, but this is clearly a tipping point in Chicago. Who knows if which way we're going to tip. I want to understand why this case, why Laquan McDonald was a tipping point, the video, and we got to talk about race and poverty because, of course, that's central to what's happened here. Mary, can you tell us why this lit the fire?
Well, of course, the video. I mean, because before the video, even though you'd written about it and had really explained that this young man was shot 16 times, there's something, we're visual people. So to see that, in this internet age, to actually see his body, to see his body spin like that, to see the puffs of smoke that came out of that officer's gun, to see that it just kind of boggled the mind. Everybody was affected. I don't care what side of town you lived on. I don't care what you thought about police. I don't care. You had a reaction to that video. That's the first thing. The second thing is, once people knew that someone in the mayor's office saw it, that the lawyers saw it, that the aldermen heard about it, that money exchanged hands, $5 million settlement was paid in this case, that opened up all these questions. So now people want to know, wait a minute, what did the mayor know when? And, you know, did he ever see the video? All these questions came up. So I think that the visual of the shooting is what really made this explode.
Yeah, I think that's true. And at the same time, I think there is something mysterious. And I say this as somebody who started writing about this case in November of 2014 and poking around to try to find witnesses and standing at the site of the shooting, trying to contemplate what happened. So before there was, I barely knew the name Laquan McDonald. Before there was a story, there's sort of the effort to construct the story. And Mary joined soon after in writing about it. And so to go from that point to now, where Laquan McDonald, the name Laquan McDonald is like the name Emmett Till, and is joined a litany of other names that are a kind of grim shorthand we now have for, to go back to the other part of your question, for really the defining issues in American life around race. That's at the bottom, that's what we're talking about. And I think we should be clear about that and somewhat in awe of the moment we find ourselves in. Because we're not just talking about a narrow set of fixes of IPRA or something.
Right.
What we're really confronting, ultimately, it seems to me, are these core issues. We've been here before. We've made marginal progress at times.
Right.
And we're, I think, ultimately talking, by way of very concrete reforms, I'm not in any way minimizing that, we're ultimately talking about finding a path to become a different kind of society. As Mary said in her opening remarks, we're confronting the kind of society we are right now.
Because, it's funny that you mentioned that now the name Laquan McDonald is so huge. It's known all over the world now.
Yes.
But I can remember when I looked at that story and found out the circumstances of how he was shot, thinking, nobody cares. How could we not care? How could there be an autopsy and they show 16 shots and nobody cared? Why aren't people marching in the street? Why aren't people upset? Why aren't there big editorial banners about this? Why hasn't the whole city stopped to say, wait a minute, we're not going to accept that? And so for me, it was just a matter of, he was a poor kid. He was a troubled kid. He was a ward of the state. So there was an intersection of not only race, but poverty. And it was like, it didn't matter. His life didn't matter. That's what shocked me. That's what got me onto this story, is that his life has to matter.
Yeah.
This is the issue in Chicago, that just because you're poor, or you're black, or you're Hispanic, or you come from a troubled background, your life still matters. And that's what I wanted to show.
And I would come in behind that in that, we focus a lot on these procedural fixes and better investigations and better training and better oversight. I mean, I think where you encounter these sort of bedrock issues of race is that what ultimately confers the impunity, and were it not for an odd set of circumstances, nobody would know about this case.
Right.
If you mean, that was really what was extraordinary, that there was a whistleblower who tipped us off about it,
Yeah.
and that's what's unusual. The biggest factor conferring impunity on abusive officers is the social status of the victim. And so in a society of profound inequalities, of profound racial disparities and exclusion, that is a condition, above all others, that allows for this kind of abuse, which goes back to the point that by way of these concrete, specific changes, none of which are going to be transformative. I mean, this may be a transformative moment in our history, but there are no transformative remedies, right? No single thing is transformative, and it's a long haul and a heavy lift. It's going to require great public and institutional stamina, clarity of purpose. But what we're doing, small fix by small fix, intervention by intervention, more information coming out, is actually trying to shape a path to become a more equal society. If we don't do that, then we're not able to fix the police.
I'll just throw out one thing. I think it was the lie that really struck people, and particularly more affluent, not poor people, a lot of white people. It was, the police said this, and then you watch the video and you're like, holy shit, that is just a bald-faced lie. And so I think that was so jarring. And people in the community know that police lie all the time, but if you're not regularly experiencing that and then it's thrown in your face, I think that was really galvanizing.
But I'm troubled by the role of the video in this. I mean, I think video is important. Video is a game changer. We all know it. We have video now. The state has video. Everybody's got video in their pockets. That's, that matters. But think about it. I mean,
Did you have to see it? Is that what?
Did you have to? Well, think about how we've known things through history, on the basis of sound reporting, witness testimony, assessing the credibility of different sources. Virtually everything we now know about this case was known in February.
Sure. Yeah, and I'll give you props because your piece in February, I mean, you had it all.
But it was all known, and Mary was on the story, and it was known, and was knowable. It was knowable. And so, we've all kind of been asleep at the switch.
But the presumption, and not just for affluent whites or people who live in good communities or safe communities, the presumption, if you haven't had a bad encounter with a police officer, if they stop you and they say, ma'am, may I have your license and your insurance card, instead of MF, may I have your license and your insurance card. If that's not been your experience, then there's a presumption that police aren't going to lie like that. So the video, video was important because it showed the lie.
Right. Let me ask about what conditions a police officer's response. I don't want to get in Jason Van Dyke's head. That's not fair. But from your experience, the racial profiling, the social status profiling that goes on, can you help us understand from an officer's perspective how that happens and then how you try to do better?
Well, I think you can't separate race from people's perception of danger and fear of other people, especially in the backdrop of the violence and the crime that goes on in certain areas of color. And so from an officer's perspective, I think the central part is that oftentimes we train officers to be the aggressor, right? As a police officer, legally, which separates you from a regular citizen, when a crime occurs, it's your duty to pursue that individual. And you don't necessarily have to back away, right? You can be the aggressor. And so I think in the mindset of the officer is that my duty is to apprehend this person at all costs, right? And then coupled with that is this fear coming into a certain situation, right? So I'm pursuing this person, but I'm also fearful of what might happen to me. If you put that in the mix of some biases that you might have towards certain people, it's more likely that you're going to use violence more quickly than someone else, right? I would even suggest that depending on your level of view of humanity of the people in the community and how good or how bad or whether or not these people are inherently bad dictates how much violence you might use against a person. So couple all that with we're pursuing this person, I'm fearful, it's my job to pursue him. At the slightest hint that this might result in danger for me, I'm going to use violence to protect myself. Really, that's all that's about, because he wasn't a danger to anyone else. Yeah. It really was about protecting oneself. And so you have to have a certain orientation to allow that to unfold in a way that says, I'm going to make sure that I try to protect the life of this person who clearly is deranged, right? This is not a criminal who has just robbed a bank or just shot someone. This is a person who is suffering from some type of mental illness. So you would think that an officer would have a different orientation, even dealing with someone from that perspective.
And can I just add that the officers who responded to the initial call did respond appropriately.
Right,
They were
that's
with
true.
they were with the boy for 5 or 6 minutes for blocks. They didn't, when he refused to drop the knife, they backed off. They stayed with him. They had all the time in the world. There were nobody else around
If
threatened.
only
Yeah.
we had just stuck
So-
right there.
Right.
No.
It is time for me to turn the mic over to you all. So if you have any questions, please line up here in the middle. All right, the mic is yours.
Okay, first of all, the officer was not acting to protect himself. The video clearly shows that Laquan McDonald was walking away from the officer when the officer shot him. There's no question about the fact that the officer is just evil. I think that you, Ms. Mitchell, and the gentleman next to her, I think that you're attempting to present a false narrative based on half-truths. It is true that this is a dynamic situation and the culture within the police department is dynamic, and that code blue and all that type stuff, and a lot of that has to do with the CPD contract and whatnot. But the reason why people are going after Rahm Emanuel isn't because of the culture of the police department and the way they enforce the laws. The reason why we're going after Rahm Emanuel is because he attempted to cover up a murder. And there's no excuse for that. That has nothing to do with culture. It has nothing to do with how many layers are stacked on top of how police officers perform their duties. He's a liar. He's a criminal. Not only should he be fired, but he should be prosecuted. If I know that somebody killed somebody, and they say, hey, James, you know what? Just don't tell nobody.
Can I,
They would come after me.
you're making
I'm
a
an
good
accessory.
point, and so we hear you. Is there a question, or did you just want to
Oh,
share your point?
yeah, I do have a question for Ms. Mitchell. I read some of your articles, and I know that you've made some pretty inflammatory remarks concerning Laquan McDonald's family. I know Pastor Hunter personally. January the 29th, when Officer
gonna
Van
ask you
Dyke...
to get to
I'm
a
going to
question.
ask the question. January 29th, when Officer Van Dyke goes back to trial, there are going to be a few hundred of us out there supporting the family.
Okay.
And the Pastor Hunter has expressed to me that your portrayal of him, he considers to be unfair. And he wants to know if you'll sit down with him and talk with him.
Definitely.
Okay? All right, so that's
And
my
I have
question.
called him, I have called and asked for a sit down, so definitely you can say, I will sit down with him.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Liz. I'm a third year. I'm a student journalist here. I have a question regarding what you mentioned earlier, Mary, about how we don't know if there were any other Laquan McDonalds and what happened before this case. Now we are seeing mothers of our mothers, sisters, wives who are coming forward and saying, well, if that happened with Laquan McDonald, what about my son or my husband? So in terms of rebuilding trust, I think that there is still a lot of truth that actually needs to be uncovered. So I wanted to ask about the possibility of having a Truth and Reconciliation Commission within the city of Chicago regarding police brutality and police murders, kind of like the Ferguson Commission, but
Right.
with more teeth. No shade, no offense. So I wanted to ask a bit about the possibility of instituting or implementing one of those commissions and what it could mean regarding this bigger idea of trust. Because to me, it's funny to ask people to forgive or to trust when there's a lot of truth that's yet to be told and a lot of questions that are yet to be answered.
Right. I think that's an excellent idea. That's something that I think that would make a difference. because people need to sit down there. It's like the John Birch cases. Once we accepted and it was established that there was torture, then people started coming forward. And I think that's exactly what we're going to see with this case, especially since there's video.
Can I also respond to that? I completely agree about the importance of truth coming out. And I think, one of the ways in which we are able to practice denial is to rush to prescription right away. We've seen it, body cameras, tasers, this, that, to rush to prescription. Mm-hmm. And we have a lot of grappling to do, a lot of reckoning to do, a lot of learning to do about the fundamental conditions of our society. And there no doubt are other Laquan McDonalds. When you see how the system responds, what cops call creative writing, in the fabricating of police reports. I don't mean that happens all the time or even often, but it happens, and we need to know more about that. So whether or not a formal Truth and Reconciliation Commission is a good idea, and it would depend a lot on the nature of that commission and the authority it had, the need for just a continuous widening of transparency and access to information, and it's happening, and it needs to continue to happen. But it's just the beginning of that process. And we need that in order to be diagnostically smart going forward. I mean, there are lots of things we know are good practices among police officers, but to build the kind of public support and institutional support for some really fundamental changes in the society, the information has to be out there. We as journalists and other public voices need to do justice to that public narrative. Is absolutely critical, so I agree completely.
I think the other point to that is for the police department to open its books. There are a number of police shootings that have happened over the years, and so there should be a 5 or 10 year review of all of those shootings, and not in the sense of trying to prosecute them, and that may happen, but to uncover what are the patterns and practices within the police department. Opening up the police reports, opening up the internal investigations, all the information related to shootings, so there can be an independent evaluation of how shootings have occurred, how they've been investigated, and how they've been sort of adjudicated in the end.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
Jeff Berkowitz, alum of the law school and grad school in economics. So quickly, there are two major problems that I've heard others discuss, and here again this evening, or two major solutions, long-term, short-term. And so I want all three of you to address the short-term, which I would suggest as the solution. The long-term, we've heard from the mayor, de-escalation, mitigation, more tasers, better qualified personnel with use of tasers. That might take a year or two to train. Somewhere for the taser people, that might be 6,000. For the whole force, it might be 12,000. I think that could take a year or two. So we had a situation where, as you've said, there's obviously a deranged person, Mr. Van Dyke. He'll be tried and so forth. I'm not trying him tonight. And then within a month of that disclosure of the video, we see there's a second bizarre shooting where somebody shot with a bat in his hand and a neighbor shot completely innocent. So we don't know all the details there, but it's possible we have a second deranged person. So the question is,
because
yeah.
we got a long
So
line behind you.
the question is, at best, you got maybe 6,000 beat officers who get these kinds of calls through the entire city. At best, you've got 1,500 in this narrow area where they may have a McDonald-type issue or the second one. Take a psychologist and go around and find the 1,500, interview them. Maybe you got 20 people who possibly are deranged, get them out of there. You've sort of greatly diminished the chances of a third shooting next month. Do you agree?
You know, I would put it somewhat differently, that the city has a vast amount of information about its officers. I mean, imagine if you were a corporation and you had tens of thousands of complaints every year about your personnel. That, harvesting that information is called quality control. It's precious information. Right now, or to date, the city has largely, almost completely disregarded that information. It has failed to connect the dots, failed to look for patterns. I think in one sense what you're talking about is pattern analysis. Right now, under the laws and practices of IPRA and other investigative agencies, internal affairs, there's no pattern analysis. An officer who has an extraordinary number of shootings, a group of officers riding together, all of whom have a large number of complaints that can't be a statistical anomaly. Something's going on there.
Right.
They don't look at that. An officer who has a particular distribution of complaints, that maybe not a huge number, but it's telling to have, oh, this guy's got 7 sexual harassment complaints. You know, that's an important data. So the failure, we don't want to suggest with our data that there's any metric for identifying a bad officer, that if you have 12 complaints or 16 complaints, you're necessarily a bad officer. There are officers out there who are great officers who've had assignments that, you know, put them in situations where they have more complaints than other officers. There are also officers with whatever that number is, 16, 18, it's arbitrary, who should be in jail, should be in treatment, should be off the force. And it's the failure of the institution to use the information to do the kind of identification of problematic officers for their sake as well as the public's sake that really is at the heart of these questions of accountability.
Can I just urge the next questioner, since we're really running short on time, to try to just keep your question concise, please?
I'd like to invite you all to talk about the interaction between police predatory action against citizens of the kind we're talking about and the kind of gun violence committed by actual criminals. There's a lot of talk about gun violence, and of course, it's illegal to have a handgun in Chicago. So one would think that policies like stop, question, and frisk would actually identify people who have guns and deter people from carrying guns and using guns. But and people usually say, well, these are entirely different issues. But it strikes me that, for example, if the public or if people didn't perceive police as being predatory, it would be much more acceptable to have a police person walk up to someone and strike up a conversation and ask, what are you doing? And so on. But has this interaction, the trust actually helps you solve crimes and identify real criminals? Has this ever been done right? And what kind of mindset? Like, I would think the mindset that could do stop, question, and frisk well would also not tolerate known predators among the police. But can you talk about this issue?
Anybody want to bite?
Well, I mean, I think it's clear that when you have a police department that has a better relationship with the community, a relationship of trust, a relationship of legitimacy, that there's going to be more cooperation. And so, as you stated, I mean, if you have a police department that is able to go into the community and approach individuals in a way that doesn't fray the relationship, it's going to be much easier to manage problems within that community. So it just makes sense that that type of orientation is going to be there. One of the things you talked about is this issue of, and I don't know if this was the connection that you were making, issue with crime in communities, or significant crime in communities and police officers using violence, or them using more violence as a reason for being so fearful and using violence. I think you do have to separate those issues, because that's an area you don't want to move down when you say that, well, this area is very violent, that's why officers are shooting so many people. There isn't necessarily that connection, right? And when an officer has that mindset, that's when you get into a situation where everyone becomes a threat.
Right.
You really have to base it on individual cases. What is the behavior that's happening at that point in time is the reason for you using violence to control a situation, or using force to control a situation. So I hear people say that a lot of times, but you do have to separate those two issues.
I'd also make two quick responses to the question. One is that maybe you're not talking about stop and frisk as a mode of interaction, but having a conversation. You know, having a human interaction, being curious, learning something about who you're talking to.
That sounds so quaint.
Yeah, but you know, we encourage that, right? But the other point about stop and frisk, just as a policy, is think back on that litany of names, starting with Michael Brown. Michael Brown stopped for jaywalking. Eric Gardner selling loose cigarettes. You know, there's so many, a tail light or a minor traffic thing for Sandra Bland. You know, again and again, Du Bois, it's another minor traffic thing. One of the things we can do, going back to your comment about what can happen quickly, is we can reduce the occasions for those kinds of things to happen and go off the rails. These, you know, it's really one of the striking, just sort of empirical realities of this sequence of high-profile, horrific incidents, is that they've all arisen from trivial occasions, trivial law enforcement occasions. This isn't the bank robber. This isn't the, you know, breaking up a gang war.
No, I mean, it's the broken windows, zero
Right.
tolerance
So
philosophy in terms of
revisiting and
hotspot
reconsidering,
policing.
yeah.
But on the other hand, this is the dilemma. If you're living in a community, you're a store owner, you don't want somebody standing outside of your store selling loose cigarettes or anything else. Or if you're in a community and you see people who are involved in activity that is illegal, you want to call a police officer. So I think that it really gets down to what is the policy, what is the training that police officer brings with him when he responds to the call.
I mean, there's a range of strategies to deploy, but when you think about a Mike Brown incident where a young man is walking down the street, is that a complaint that the neighborhood has had? I mean, why is the officer addressing that? And if it is a complaint, then maybe there's another way to deal with it. Mike Brown has a mother, has a father, has a grandmother. Maybe from a community policing standpoint, you go to Mike Brown's mother and grandmother and father and say, hey, we've had complaints in this community about individuals walking in the street. This is a hazard to individuals. Can you work with us to deal with this behavior within the community? Does it necessarily have to go towards giving a young man a ticket for jaywalking? You know, there are other strategies to deal with that. I'm not saying that.
But it's not dismissing the problem.
No.
Yeah.
Dismissing the problem. And maybe that might be the ultimate strategy, but have you gone through several steps to address it before that occurs?
Yeah, or maybe the fact that Black people should just be allowed the same human rights as white people. In addition to the fact that in Chicago, you can own a gun. It's called concealed to carry, just like it's concealed to carry in Cleveland, where Tamir Rice was killed, and he had a toy gun but was still shot down for something that it is legal to have. But outside of that, my question is, the definition of insanity is to keep doing the same thing and expecting a different result. And I think that what's going on here in Chicago is insane. And this is primarily because 40% of the police budget, of the city budget, goes towards policing. So we're consistently talking about these methods of reform, more tasers, as if tasers don't kill people, haven't killed people, numerous people in the past, and that's more money. And there's more police cameras, yet there was just a case about 2 days ago in the Chicago Tribune of 24 police officers who have been charged or caught for messing with their cameras. So we're consistently funneling more money into an institution that obviously doesn't work. So at what point will we stop with the discussions of reform and change our minds instead to reinvest in these communities that people seem so afraid of, instead of keep investing in a system that doesn't work? So why don't we start a discussion instead of maybe reducing that budget to 20% or 15% and reallocating that to communities that could actually use it, instead of closing schools and closing mental health facilities that people need?
Okay, so I've been reading a lot lately about how the laws that we put into the books themselves have an impact on how laws are enforced, particularly with regard to the legacy of the war on drugs, and how certain laws, without necessarily being written to disproportionately affect certain communities, although that's arguable, end up disproportionately affecting certain communities, right? So I'm wondering, in our discussion of police reform and our discussion of solving this problem of violence, how do we, I guess, account for, how do we bring the laws that are in place themselves and the way that our courts function into this discussion as well?
That's a tough one.
Well, I think we're seeing some of that. I think we're seeing some of that when we begin to look at alternatives to incarceration. When we look at changes being made in the drug laws that allow for small amounts of marijuana to not become, be criminalized. Even when we look at the fact that there's some, in the federal level, that drug offenders, people who have been incarcerated for longer period of times that were considered unfair and inequitable treatment, that they've reduced some of those sentences and have allowed people to come out. So I think we are beginning to go down that road. We're going in that direction, and that is a direction that we need to go in.
And I would add that one of the things that we actually know, going back to patterns of police abuse, that a great deal of abuse of different sorts, starting with corruption, happens in the zone of the war on drugs. I mean, those are the places and the details where a lot of this stuff happens.
I wanted to answer the young lady's question before she left, because she had a question about investing in other things besides police. So I know in St. Louis, as the homicides went up in St. Louis and violent crime has gone up, there's been a call for 150, 200 more police officers, which will cost over $10 million to put these officers on the street. But I agree with the young lady that in a certain ways that we are asking officers to do things that they're really not capable of doing, right? We put them in a very difficult position. And I'm not making excuses for them, because there are a lot of things that need to happen within policing and a lot of changes that need to be made. But there's another part of this equation, is that we also know the areas that are problematic, and we know sort of the demographic and the social economic problems within those communities. So instead of hotspot policing, why don't we do hotspot social services? Why don't we start to invest that $10 million into addressing some of these issues within these communities? I think police officers would love to be more a part of the solution instead of the bad parent all the time. Yeah. What if an officer had the ability to take a young person and refer them to social services? What if they had the ability to work with a family to address some of the problems within their communities? Really, the only tools that we're giving officers at this point in time is to arrest people.
Yeah.
That's what we expect them to do. And so I wholeheartedly agree with you. Instead of investing $20,000, $30,000 more dollars into policing, what clearly has not given us the bang for our buck over the course of many years, and that's not to say that officers don't do a great job in some circumstances and protect us in other circumstances. But there has to be a different way, and we have to think about really, truly investing in these communities in a way that we're investing in law enforcement.
And we're also not, those aren't two completely separate things.
No.
This is what you were describing, what Dan's describing, is really a reformulation of what public safety means.
Right.
A different way of thinking about public safety.
All right, we'll have our final questioner, please.
Okay, this builds on the laudable work that Mr. Kalven has done. I would like to suggest that in order to rebuild trust, to, quote, get rid of a lot of the bad apples, and to get away from the ineffectual police review authorities we've had to this point, that in fact we do need to have some kind of a metric system. Exactly how it should be constructed, we can debate that. But I'd like to get your input. It could be something where, if an officer has got within, say, a 5-year period, has a dozen complaints from at least 12 different people on different incidents, that he's automatically terminated, or something of that nature. You could just construct something, you could put in all kind of things, but I would like to suggest and get all of your input on having some kind of a metric system.
Well, when I said metric, I meant that you couldn't look at an officer and say he's got 12 complaints, he's a bad officer, he should be terminated, or he should be disciplined. What you should do is look and see what's going on. That's an occasion to investigate what is going on, and that's what's not happening.
And that's something that can be done right now because the city actually has all the information they need. They have the data. They can look at that information and they can begin. What I believe should happen is that you need to begin to weed out these officers who are causing these kinds of problems and have multiple complaints.
I don't have a question, but in fact, at least I've acknowledged it up front. I don't have a question. But all I wanted to say is when we created the Institute of Politics, our hope was that we would generate more light than heat, and that we could have discussions that would help illuminate some of the really pressing challenges that we face, and that our students in the community could participate in that. And I want to thank all of you for making that true tonight. You've been a wonderful, wonderful panel, and also for your ongoing efforts to shine a bright light on this problem and other problems in our community. So thank you so much for being here and for great moderating.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all so much. We hope to see you at our future events. You can find out more about the Institute and our upcoming conversations at politics.uchicago.edu. Thanks again to our great panel. We appreciate it. And to all of you for your good questions.